So the other day, I made a tweet calling for your Overwatch Hot Takes for this video, which could be anything Overwatch related. This is probably a good time to say that if you want to keep up with things like these, and also keep up with the channel, do feel free to drop me a follow on Twitter. The link will be in the top line of the description. Now I've categorized these hot takes into 4 main categories. The first one will be considering Overwatch Competitive and the Ranked mode, as well as some takes on Overwatch Toxicity. The second category will be Overwatch League and Overwatch 2. The third category will be on Overwatch Compositions, and the final category will be on Overwatch Heroes, which is the biggest section there is. I'll also be evaluating each of these hot takes, rating them on a scale of 1 to 10, and I'll be ranking them at the end of this video. First off, good old Coach Spilo says, brawl comps are usually visually confusing and boring to watch. Anyone who thinks 222 was bad for the game is either a moron or has major nostalgia goggles on. Most semi-pros/pros give terrible balance feedback and will whine about anything. This doesn't excuse Blizzards. And he also leaves at the bottom, oh, and voice chat is almost always a negative in ranks below Diamond unless you have an Iron Mental. Now, it comes as no surprise, but this is a pretty spot on take. Most coaches and even viewers will think that brawl comps are usually visually confusing and boring to watch, and this is why talent dive, especially when hero bans were a thing back in Overwatch League, became pretty widely hated because you would lose team fights because of one ability and you couldn't even see or analyze what ability that was because everything is in such short range and there's so many effects going on, and this is why, to an extent, GOATs had to be viewed from a third person POV and not a first person POV because there's so much going on that an average viewer will not be able to see. As I also hinted on prior, is also pretty hard to break down because most teamfights would be lost due to one micro ability, whereas again, like poke comps or dive comps, there's a lot more macro going on in terms of, oh, we lost this fight because we didn't control this flank, for example, right? So I would say he's pretty spot on with that point. With 222, I would even go as far as saying that this isn't even a hot take, this is just a cold take. Yes, 222 has been objectively good for the game. It stopped those 4-man DPS comps coming in, even if Q times were raised. With most pros giving terrible balance feedback, again, I mostly agree with this. This is why you don't see games being balanced by pros. And the reason for that is because pros often have these preconceived notions and confirmation bias in terms of what they want to see in the game. And for the last point, I would even go as far as saying that voice chat is pretty much useless below Master or even Grandmaster. Most players don't know what useful communication is, and there's a lot of toxicity that goes on, just generally speaking. Most communication you will get, even if you're in a stick stack with people that you know, is pretty much null. So I'll rate this take a 9 out of 10. The only thing I would really say is that not all of these are hot takes, I would say. Some of them are a bit obvious. For example, I think most people think that 222 has been good for the game. But aside from that, of course the Overwatch League coach is going to have a good take. Big surprise. Next up, a take that contradicts Spilo's, or one of the points at least, is from Universal Oddity saying, not at least being in voice chat is throwing. Now, you could argue that in games like Rainbow Six Siege, everyone is in voice chat from the get-go. Like, you have to manually mute the entire team in Rainbow Six Siege, whereas, in Overwatch, you can just leave voice chat from the get-go. And honestly, in games like Rainbow Six Siege, I don't think voice chat has had a huge impact on the ranked experience, and especially for Overwatch, I don't really know why so many people put such an emphasis, especially in the lower ranks, right, of being in voice chat. Like 99% of the time, you just want to be in voice chat just to flame a player for playing badly, but you're not actually going to, say anything constructive, or you're not going to have this game-breaking plan, or, there's nothing going to be amazingly big brain that you're going to say. And considering there's already text chat, even in console now recently, I don't really see the whole point of being in voice chat to tell someone, oh, you need to swap off D.Va, or you need to swap off Zarya, or whatever. So yeah, I disagree with this take, but at least I understand the reasoning, and for that I will give it a 4 out of 10 at least. Next up is a tweet from I'm sorry, I'm butchering your name, bro, I'm so sorry. But he says, Overwatch is at its best with friends and not worth playing without them. Also, custom games are more fun than comp. Now, I mostly agree with this. Overwatch is definitely at its best when you're playing with friends. I mean, if you watch Super's latest video playing with Sleepy and the OTF team, whatever it's called, they definitely had a lot of fun playing, especially having the nostalgia chips to GOATs and whatever. But I do think that there's an aspect for strictly competitive players that don't really want to muck around and wouldn't mind playing by themselves and solo queuing. I mean, a ton of players already do that anyways. So yeah, just to quickly wrap this up and keep up the pace, I'm going to give this take a 7 out of 10. Next up, a tweet from Poppy saying, one tricking off meta heroes is throwing. Now, I can definitely see the logic for this in terms of a scrim environment or really, really high ranked, but this just doesn't apply to most ranks and most people anyways. So for that, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 10. If you are a plat player watching this and have a Bastion one trick on your team, work around them. Any hero works in the metal ranks. Next up, we have Goldie saying to bring back hero bans for comp. At least with that, they can see how powerful characters are, or without other characters in order to balance better, and I mean, everyone loved that week where you didn't have to play against Hitscan. Honestly, if the devs implemented Rainbow Six Siege's hero ban system, I think it would be great for the game. It would relieve stress off the developers in terms of balancing, because we kind of do that ourselves with hero bans, and it would give them good direction in terms of, oh, this hero's being banned a lot, let's see what we could do in terms of balance. Like, imagine hero bans before 222. Goats probably wouldn't have existed then, and they would also encourage people to not one trick and have a more versatile hero set. So overall, I'm giving this a 8 out of 10 take. Next up, we have Textress saying how banning one chicken will solve nothing for the game and essentially alienate another chunk of the player base, and how OTPs do still have a high win rate in GM because they can learn and adapt around their team comp. Now, I do think that one-tricking is unhealthy for the game. I don't think it's throwing, but I do think it puts unnecessary strain on all other teammates in the comp. For example, let's say you're on Lijiang Control Center and you're running Mercy with Reinhardt and they're running a full Brawl comp. Well, you're probably gonna lose that in high GM games. That's just how it's gonna be. And you might also have a Doomfist OTP playing up against a Cassidy, Torbjorn and Brig. Like, he's going to do nothing against that comp. But those are the exceptions to the rule. And I do think that for the most part, banning one-tricking isn't really going to help anyone. Yes, I do think that in those high SR games where you are running Mercy up against a full Brawl comp on a Brawl map, you're probably not going to win that no matter what. But for the majority of the player base, one-tricking is really not an issue. So overall, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10 take. Right, I'm going to speed up the pace now. Next up, we have 2 tweets from A Nebjamin, who says that egoing high players is very fun as their reactions are priceless when they get angry. I think this is a pretty good take, as long as you're doing it ironically and you're not actually annoyed and egoing them and you're ironically doing it. So I would give that an 8 out of 10. And the other take he had was that PC players are 10 times more toxic than console players. I can't really speak on this because I'm not a PC player, but I do think there are more cultural differences. For example, if you're from the UK, you may be more toxic than someone from America, whether that be East Coast or West Coast. That might just be my personal experience though, who knows. So yeah, I'm just going to leave this one unrated. On to the second section, which is on Overwatch League and Overwatch 2, starting off with my tweet about the London Spitfire, who I predict will be the new Paris Eternal. They'll finish the top half of Overwatch League, and Hardy will redeem himself from all the public backlash he's gotten. Now, I obviously can't rate this, we'll see how this ages over time, but hopefully I'm right. Next up, we have one from Azonix saying that getting rid of Brent and Sideshow is a good move as it makes the league appear more professional, worse, but more professional. I don't even think that this is a hot take. I think most people know that Brent and Sideshow aren't very professional, and that for the corporate overlords and for the investors, especially going into Overwatch 2, they want things to be clean. So for that, I'm going to give you a 7 out of 10, although the accuracy is much higher than a 7 out of 10. Next up, we have King Maya saying that Fletter is the undisputed GOAT. The only one that comes close is Violet. Now there's a reason why Fletter got MVP in 2020, but saying that no one comes close apart from Violet is a bit of a stretch. You have players like Leaf, Pelican, Alarm, and players that do come close to Fletter. So overall, I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10 take. Next up, we have probably the worst take in this entire video, and it's from Lustful Scholar saying that 5v5 will turn the game into Valorant. Now, yes, 5v5 will make the game more deathmatchy, will make the game more individualistic, but that in no way means that it will be anywhere near fundamentally what Valorant is. Valorant is fundamentally CSGO with some abilities which may have some parallels to Overwatch in some cases. Overwatch is a MOBA mixed in with an FPS, whereas Valorant is a pure FPS with slow, methodical, strategic gunplay and movement. The game is nowhere near close fundamentally to draw any meaningful comparisons, and removing one player from each side is really going to have no major impact. 1 out of 10 take. Now onto the third section, which is based on compositions. Vicarious says that the reason so many people like GOATs was because if you weren't a DPS player, it was fun to play, but as a DPS, you just kinda get shit on. But for me, GOATs was the most fun I've ever had in it. I do partially agree with some of this. So the reason why I think the people that liked GOATs liked it was because it moved away from the FPS reliance and having pure mechanical skill. It was a lot more MOBA focused, and GOATs Overwatch was pretty much a completely different game to just normal regular 2v2 Overwatch. And in terms of whether you like GOATs or not, it mainly boils down to whether you prefer the FPS movement of Overwatch or the MOBA-esque mechanics of Overwatch. Personally, I prefer the MOBA-esque movement, but like Vicarious says, DPS players will typically prefer the FPS sort of movement, which was mainly gone in GOATs. With that being said, there are definitely some tank players and definitely some support players who did not like GOATs at all. but I do generally agree with the correlation that DPS players dislike the GOATs more than supports and tanks. So for that reason, I'm going to go with a 6.5 out of 10. Next up, Hazonic says, Overwatch isn't meant to have every character at the same skill level all the time. It's meant to have fluid and changing power levels to coerce the game into different metas and different playstyles. And honestly, this pretty accurately echoes SVB's point of view, which is that it's okay to have some lower skill level heroes, such as Moira, but it starts becoming an issue when those low skill level heroes start becoming meta. But I do slightly disagree with the second half of his tweet, and that is mainly due to maps. For example, on Legion Control Center, even when Brawl wasn't meta, you would still see Reinhardt being pulled on that map, even in Overwatch League and even in Overwatch high ranks. But I will say that it is becoming more commonplace to see typically Brawl-esque maps such as King's Row run more different variations of comps and be more fluid, like Haz is saying. For example, Shanghai Dragons are popularizing playing Poke Dive on King's Row, and Double Shield on first point defense King's Row, and Double Bubble on third point defense King's Row do see some play. So I do mostly agree with this tweet. 7.5 out of 10. Next up, Kondagar says, Double Shield BAP Zen was the best meta ever to play and watch in the history of Overwatch. Now, maybe not to play because BAP Zen is a very glass cannon type backline, but that does make it for a great watching experience, and it was great to see how teams would adapt when playing it up against Dive, but to play, maybe not. And in the history of Overwatch, maybe not. Next up, we have Chris saying that Double Shield wasn't enabled by Sigurisa, but it was rather enabled by characters like BAP and Brig having extremely high sustain. And honestly, this is a pretty bang on tweet. Now, just from the gate, maybe you could disagree with this by saying that Sigma had a 1500 HP shield and Orisa had a 900 HP shield, but after that, it was certainly enabled by BAP and Brig, and people hating on Sigurisa didn't really see the amount of sustain that characters like BAP and Brig really had. In fact, here's a clip from Spylo back in August 2020 explaining this exact concept, but in the meantime, I'll give this take an 8.5 out of 10. The only thing is that he doesn't specify AoE healing, and that Widowmaker wasn't really played that much, unless it was a specific map like Havana or Junkertown, but still a very good take.
Especially with these two heroes, between Rally, Inspire, BAP Shift, BAP Right Click, and Immortality Field, you have 5 methods of AoE sustain or survivability. So like every other support in the game relies on their ultimate for AoE healing, or a significant cooldown like Nade or Moira Orb. This is why when people like break the trope of burst, it's because you play a hero like Pharah, or you play a hero like, even like Sigma, or Tracer, or Genji, and any AoE healing that you do, or AoE damage, like a little spam here, a little spam there, it doesn't add up.
Next up, still on the topic of Double Shield, Weza says, Double Shield is more fun than Dive. For context, Wes was one of the players on my previous team that I coached, and he was a Sigma player, so this obviously makes a lot of sense. Now, I don't really like coaching Dive, and the reason is basically because of value flaw. It's a lot easier to get value out of Double Shield than it is out of Dive, because Dive requires all sorts of coordination, whereas Double Shield isn't very complicated from a very basic level, and Double Shield can also teach map control. So personally, I find it a bit more fun than Dive, but I'm not saying that I hate Dive. I quite like the Poke Dive hybrids, and by the way, if you haven't watched my Poke Dive hybrid guide, link in the top right, but for this take, I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Next up, Callum says that GOATs is only considered good because of nostalgia. I actually do reply to this one, and I say that I agree that people do love GOATs for nostalgia, but I do disagree with the conclusion that people only love GOATs solely for that reasoning. And again, this refers back to me saying that some people will naturally prefer the FPS side of Overwatch, and some people will prefer the MOBA side of Overwatch. 5 out of 10 take. Lastly, we have Celebrimble saying that GOATs is the most honest meta to show how truly good a team is. Now when I first read this, I actually quite liked this opinion, but when digging deeper, there are some flaws. So firstly, how do you define what good actually means? Does mechanical skill count on this? Is mechanical skill not an honest way of showing how good a team is? And secondly, even if you disregard mechanical skill and only focus on the macro and teamwork aspects, there's still plenty of comps, such as the Atlanta Rain Brawl comp or the Shanghai Dragons Poke Dive comp, that still show excellent macro, coupled with some mechanical aim. And seeing teams like Shanghai Dragons pull off the Poke Dive comp on maps where it's quite unorthodox, e.g. King's Row, is quite a feat. But I do get the teamwork aspect, I do get the Vancouver Titans, the San Francisco Shock 2019 type of business, which does make sense and I do understand that. And for that reason, I'll give this take a
light to decent 5 on this one.
Now into the last but biggest section, which is the heroes. Starting off with the Swedish Santa, saying that Mercy's 5-man resurrection would have not been a major issue if Sombra was part of the original release. Now I actually find this take really interesting, because it made me think on why this wouldn't work. So if you analysed in the team fight in terms of when Mercy's would res, it it would normally be at the end of a team fight. This means that Sombra has to do absolutely nothing throughout the entire fight up until the very end to be able to hack the Mercy before she can even get off her 5-man resurrection. Which you could argue is possible, like if Sombra scouts the Mercy before the teamfight begins, and then gets ready to hack the Mercy before she reses, that could be doable. But because it's the end of the teamfight, Sombra may not have hack available, she may have forgotten where the Mercy was, Mercy may have changed positions, Sombra may be unable to scout because of heroes like D.Va shooting all over the place. So I think it would still be really inconsistent, and it would also force this really weird meta of having to play Sombra to counter Mercy. So I do understand the reasoning for this take, and I think it's the most interesting one in the entire video, but I'm ultimately going to have to disagree with it, considering that you'd be forced to play Sombra, even in Brawl comps, just to counter a Mercy res. 5 out of 10. Next up we have Jayhurst saying that Orisa was the worst addition to the game. Now it's obvious to see why people hate Orisa, she's a very boring hero and kind of enabled a very boring comp, but I think you can make a pretty good argument that characters like Brig, maybe even Moira are worse than Orisa. So I'm going to give this a 4.5 out of 10 take. Next up, we have Twisted saying that if Mercy wasn't in the game, it would be 2 times more enjoyable. Now this may seem like a very simple take, but there's a lot of reasons why Mercy isn't very good for the game, so to say. The first is damage breakpoints. DPS becomes so much more hard to balance because of Mercy damage boost. Characters like Ashe, or even Echo to a lesser extent, become make or break due to Mercy. Secondly, and I think this is where the take is coming from, it's because of Mercy OTPs. And to be fair, on console at least, there are quite a few Mercy players who will just queue with the DPS either using mouse and keyboard or they're just using some sort of advantage over the enemy team. And as a result, you end up getting a ton of boosted Mercy mains past 3500. And because Mercy doesn't really have a transferable skill set, if you're playing Mercy against Brawl, you better hope and pray that you're not playing on a Brawl map. But again, back to the one tricking thing about alienating some part of the player base, it obviously wouldn't be enjoyable for everyone. But with that being said, I do think that for most people, if heroes like Mercy in the game were at least reworked, or if damage boost was given a timer where it could decrease over time, and if heroes like Moira and Brig were reworked, then I would think the game is a whole lot more enjoyable. So as a surprise to some people, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10 take. Next up we have Ton Makita saying that Cassidy isn't as strong anymore as the community is making him out to be. Now I do agree with the sentiment that the community are exaggerating Cassidy, but he's still very, very strong. Cassidy is one of the most versatile heroes in the game. He's got a failsafe with his flashbang, he can 3-shot any squishy in the game he wants to. A lot more people are recognizing the power of High Noon in terms of clearing out high grounds. And really, in Ranked, aside from Soldier 76, there's no real competition to Cassidy, and in Scrims, Cassidy is a whole lot better than Soldier. The only thing I would say is that in Brawl, Sim Mei Brawl is becoming more popular than the Cassidy Mei Brawl. The hero will still get a ton of value from most players and most teams. 4.5 out of 10 take. Just please nerf Cassidy's HP back to 200s. Next up is the Fineliner, who basically had Twisted's take from earlier, but a lot more extreme. 5 out of 10 take. Next up with the Kaj, saying that Orisa is very fun to play when played correctly, and takes a lot more brain than Ryan. I agree with the first part, literally just watch Sparrow's review of a 4500 Orisa player, it's more detailed than you might think. But I don't agree that it takes a lot more brain than Reinhardt. The biggest thing with Orisa is probably just knowing where to position, and the timing and placement of your shield in coordination with your team. 6.5 out of 10 take. Next up we have Vaz G, saying that Ana is the strongest support, and has been for a long time. Below GM. He says that her kit is better than Moira's, and her CDs make her hard to punish. Now I think this take is very hard to evaluate because it's so relativist depending on each rank. For example, I think that Moira is actually the strongest support in Platinum and below. Damager plus Coalescence onto backline is basically a free team fight every time, and most Anas in Plat are incompetent, and even though Ana is way better than Moira, most Plat Anas will not know how to nade properly. In Diamond and Master is where things start to change a lot. There's still a lot of incompetent Baptistes at Diamond and Master, in which case an Nana boost into a Reinhardt plus a good nade is going to get more value than a Mortality Field plus Matrix. Her CDs also don't really make her hard to punish, especially in Plat and below, where there's almost no peeling. I'd hope and think that despite Ana's CDs, Genji and Tracer should be able to still kill Ana. I do think though that you can put a somewhat competent case forward for Ana being the stronger support in High Plat, Diamond, and maybe Master, it just depends. So overall, I'm going to give this a 5.5 out of 10. Next up we have Ruben saying that Moira is the worst character in the game. This is kind of similar to the hate towards Mercy, but Moira's character design is just so one-dimensional and so low skilled. Maybe you could put a case forward for Brigitte. It just depends whether you're talking about character design or their value ceiling or whatever. 7 out of 10 take. Next up we have Robbo saying that Winston is the most mechanically demanding and game sense oriented hero in the game other than maybe Tracer. Now I first looked at this and I was a bit confused, but then I started realizing that this take is pretty much bang on. In terms of game sense, maybe D.Va could be in there, and with mechanically demanding, maybe Genji's blade comes close to primal, you know, with Genji's like cavalry and whatnot, but I've seen some crazy primals before, like perfectly landing and timing a jump after the Tracer recalls. And in fact, here's a clip of Spyro giving the skill ceiling of Winston a 4 out of 4, mostly because of how much skill Primal requires.
As a Winston, you're playing completely different depending on the composition that you're playing with and the composition that you're playing against. Playing Winston into Double Sniper, playing Winston into Hard Brawl. Is it the most mechanically difficult ultimate to use in the game? Like, ceiling-wise? Like, it's got to be Pulse Bomb, Blade, and Primal. Those are the most difficult. I don't know of, I mean, you can make a good argument that it's harder than Pulse Bomb, and maybe harder than Blade as well. In terms of Primal Rage, I don't know. It's got to be 3.5 or 4 for me.
I think so. I think again, the sort of punish that Winston gets makes it a 4.
9.5 out of 10 take. I'm struggling to critique this. Next up, we have Dom saying that people still don't know how to deal with Hog in 2022, and the strongest part of BAP is his damage mixed in with regen burst, not his lamp. I agree with the first part. I don't even think that's a hot take really. Hog still stomps in ranked no matter what rank you're talking about, unless you're in a 4400 plus lobby with pro players. But the second part I just disagree with. And yes, a very strong part of BAP is his damage weaved in with his healing, but his lamp is basically an ultimate of cooldown, and it's what makes Brawl so unbearable to play. So in total, I would give the first statement a 7 out of 10, but the second part a 3 out of 10, giving an average of a 5 out of 10. Next up, we have Shane saying that no matter how much people hate her, Sombra is one of the most fun heroes to play. Now I think that a lot of Sombra players, like Brig players, are very sadistic people, and they like seeing people suffer. No matter how annoying Sombra is, there's no denying that she is pretty fun to play. The only thing I'd say that up against double sniper comps, or up against Torb Kree comps, she's not really that fun to play, and EMP can be a frustrating ultimate to use. And it's also annoying when you get your hack disrupted. But overall, I think I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10. Gargoyle's Left Toe says that Mass Vez should come back and Valk should be an ability. 2 out of 10 take. My brain would hurt to explain this. Next up, ITP Paladin says that Echo and Hamster are OP and broken as shit and needs to be removed from the game. I'll settle for just Ball though. Echo used to be OP before her nerfs, but now she's more online. She's still really powerful and versatile and is basically a better Genji, but I wouldn't go as far as calling her OP and broken. Hammond is kinda broken in rank though, since he is one of the most self-reliant tanks there is, paired with Roadhog as well, and unless you're running crazy CC like Cassidy Sombra, you're not going to be stopping Hammond. And even then, Hammond can still get a ton of value through roll-throughs and well-timed engages. I'll give this a 7 out of 10. Orangutan says to please buff Lucio, and yeah, the guy needs a buff, probably to his ult charge, as then Paul concludes in this video here. Since this wasn't too specific, and it's not really a hot take, I'll give this a 7 out of 10. Next up, Zerkus says that GM Genji players are the most skilled players in the game. Now I can obviously see why he would say this take. Genji is a pretty bad hero right now, and his blade is arguably one of the highest skill ceiling abilities to use. But there are heroes like Winston, as mentioned prior, Tracer, D.Va, Doomfist, who all have higher skill ceilings than Genji in my opinion, but Genji still has a very high skill ceiling, so I'll give this a 7 out of 10 take. Alright, so these are the complete rankings out of everyone in this entire video. In joint first place, we have Sparlow and Robbo. In second place, we have Chris or Swaggy Player. And in joint third place, we have Twisted, one of Neb's tweets, Tektress, and Goldie. Let me know if you guys want me to do a part 2 to this, I'm more than happy to do so. And if you enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.